Good morning. Nice to see you all, and it's good to be back. I was just reflecting that it's been 10 years since we first started convening here, and I just wanted to see a show of hands. Is there anyone else other than Robin, Lakshmi, and myself, and a couple other people I know, who has actually been here and been coming to all of them? I know Tina's been here as well. So isn't that really exciting? It's kind of surreal to know that we've been convening. Love the embrace of the philosophy of this symposium in the name change. So congratulations in getting that done. So like Tina and Beth, I come at my research work through from a very grounded perspective. And the grounded perspective that I'm going to share insights with you today from is how I came to think about power, anxiety, sociocultural ideals, and my leaping framework through my teaching with my students at the Wharton School. So when I arrived at Wharton in 2017, that was my second position as junior faculty, I was invited to teach a class on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I had no idea what that meant or what that experience was going to be like, particularly coming on the heels of the 2016 presidential election at, again, the Wharton School, where I was teaching this class on diversity, equity, inclusion. So I actually thought that my students who were taking my elective classes, I have undergraduate and MBA classes, I thought they were going to look like the people in this room. But instead, I found myself educating a lot of people who identify as being more from majority groups. And so as I was sharing all of our wonderful insights and research with this group, they would make a line outside my office to have one-on-one appointments to begin to share with me what I have now characterized as varying degrees of anxiety about this topic. So my research agenda kind of shifted naturally to really try to figure out how can I be helpful to people who feel very anxious about these topics, and how can I begin to understand that as a catalyst. That said, today I will ground some of this work and focus on cross-racial allyship, though my frameworks spans multiple marginalized groups, including gender and the intersections in between. And certainly I talk about things, lots of emotions. This one will focus on anxiety, but I did my homework, Robin. I also tried to link it to the theme of the conference, and I choose to embrace love today. So let's talk about love. Many of you know, this is like really cliche, especially as I'm standing here. Many of you know that I am, I don't know if it's newly or recently engaged, and I'm getting married in October. Thank you. And so I'm thinking a lot about love, so much so that when Robin sent us some insights on love to ponder, this one really stood out to me, and I'd like to channel this in us for us as I talk about allyship in a bit. And so this is actually an excerpt from Lama Rod Owen's book, Love and Rage, The Path of Liberation Through Anger. Lama will be here tomorrow, so I'm just previewing some of this work. Love isn't actually meant to feel good, nor is it meant to be fun all the time. Real love and true love actually can bring us into complex, challenging situations. And that is the thing about love, which people don't understand. When you understand that about love, we can enter into a more authentic, direct, and honest relationship with ourselves and how we relate to others. So this verb love, is this act and wish to experience freedom. Being free sometimes, though, is not so easy. So as we think about allyship, with me, at least today, I want you to think about allyship as love, as an act, not just an experience, but as an act of love, as potentially an act of love. And what would it look like if we were to re-envision allyship in that way? So what is allyship? Why is it important? How do we think about being an ally to racial minority professionals, which I will abbreviate as RMPs for the sake of brevity? What we know from research is that across a variety of domains, many of you know who also studied this topic, allyship, you know that it crosses disciplines. But collectively, if you think about this, what we know is that allyship is often defined as something that occurs when an individual with some degree of power or privilege provides some type of support to someone from a marginalized group who has relatively less power or privilege. And the idea behind this is we're trying to reduce some type of disparity, just to keep it broad for now. We know that allyship has the potential to promote the well-being of racial minority professionals, that it's important for helping to advance racial minority professionals to leadership roles. But one thing that we often forget, and I'd like to continue to bring front and center, is that people who are from both minority and majority groups have the potential to be allies to racial minority professionals. So I, as a Black woman, have the potential to be an ally to other Black women, Black men, etc. So as I've been sort of trying to help my students understand what they can do and should do, and try to be, I think, prescriptive but also evidence-based, is as I began to disentangle across a wide variety of literatures, when we talk about allyship actions, kind of what are these things? How might we categorize and conceptualize them? And in a conceptual paper, I've talked about LEAP allyship behavior broadly, but I've also had the chance to collect stories from hundreds of people about allyship broadly, but also about cross-racial allyship broadly. And it largely coalesces around these 4 categories of allyship actions. There's a big L in here: looking, listening, learning, and locating oneself, engaging in discussions, a deeper dive into the interaction, which is asking probing questions, and providing support. Where is Ray? Ray, you know, one of the initial versions of this paper, and one day I will get back to it, is very somatic. But I think, as a field, we are still working through embracing emotions as part of the things we study. I do believe we have a long way to go before we can all collectively understand how to integrate somatic concepts into our work. So help me out as I begin to think later about to better articulate the somatic version of this paper. Okay, so I'm going to start from a place of top-down allyship initiatives. And what I mean by this is basically formal diversity interventions that organizations implement. Many of you have been part of these. I've been part of these, where organizations say, hey, we want to mandate allyship training, or we want to create an intervention whereby all of our managers or employees are going to learn from you, academic, about how to be an ally. So that's what I mean by a top-down allyship initiative, as opposed to you're just trying to be a good person and work with somebody else through the things that they need. So the catalysts for these top-down allyship initiatives are often social justice crises. Again, they're organization-sponsored campaigns, programs, and trainings. They tend to focus on centering a visible and vocal support of professionals from historically marginalized groups at work. And these campaigns can prescribe a range of allyship actions, ranging from listening to people share their stories about bias and mistreatment, all the way to advocacy. However, what I submit in my work is that this formal dynamic can evoke managerial anxiety if we focus on managers as often the targets of these initiatives, people managers, if you will. And so these top-down allyship initiatives, they're a type of diversity intervention. Let's not forget that. And what diversity interventions are all about is about organizational change. So as we start to track that, what we then see is, well, naturally, we know from our research that change initiatives often do and can evoke managerial anxiety because they make organizational power dynamics salient. And so if you look at the graphic here, this is what I'm talking about, is as from a managerial perspective, this top-down diversity intervention, allyship initiative, feels very much as if it's implemented by someone's senior leaders who control the social order. And that anxiety is a manifestation of my experience of feeling like this is being done to me, not done with me or done for me. I'm not going to go through the whole model, but this is where I'm going with this, is as we think about power dynamics and managerial anxiety as catalysts. In this paper, I actually talk about many versions of allyship, but just let's focus on cross-racial for now, for the sake of today. We're talking about these top-down workplace allyship initiatives catalyzing this managerial anxiety and that leading to LEAP allyship behavior. I'm going to complicate this for us in just a moment, but that's where I'm going with this. But what is, I think, important to recognize is sort of from a lay perspective, but also from an academic perspective, we don't all have the same understanding of what allyship behavior actually is. In fact, if you read the critical and feminist perspective on allyship behavior, you will read a lot about allyship as structurally oriented and necessarily incorporating considerations of power and having outcomes for power. And so the actions that are often described in this literature are aimed at challenging or changing inequitable systems and structures. And so those are the assumptions, implicit and explicit, about what allyship is in this literature. Now I'm going to make this sound like dichotomous, but you know there's a fuzzy set here. So if we kind of go to the other side, if we were to create clarity around another scholarly way of thinking about allyship, we can turn to what I'm just broadly characterizing as more psychological perspective. Again, I acknowledge there's some overlap here. But if you look at this body of literature, how it talks about allyship is pretty much as an individualized set of remedies, actions aimed at engaging in self-reflection. So as Tina was talking about digging, how much we dig varies widely in this literature, acknowledging that there are different experiences that we have as members of advantaged, disadvantaged, and intersectionally advantaged and disadvantaged groups, the importance of becoming knowledgeable about different social identity groups and their experiences, addressing bias, affirming experiences, so on, you get it. But really fundamentally focused on sort of the interpersonal one-on-one, individually, let me help you, as opposed to change the system dynamic. So I found this quite interesting. And so have the people who have read my work. And so one of the things that we started to think about is what would it look like as opposed to deciding who's right or who's wrong, and what is allyship and what is not allyship, what would happen if we re-envisioned allyship as arrayed along a spectrum, and this spectrum being one in which there are more conservative, i.e. restricted forms of LEAP allyship behavior, all the way to these more progressive and these radical LEAP forms of allyship. So this is the place where I sit, and this is the place from where I theorize and conduct my research, is imagining that there is a range. That said, I think I was curious, and I'm sure many of you are, is about what helps us to understand whether people are gonna do that thing down there or this thing over here. And so let me first help us understand the differences in those allyship actions, and then we'll talk about what I suggest in my research is one potential explanatory factor. And so as we think about restricted LEAP behavior, here's how I would like you to think about each of these based on the LEAP framework. So you'll see the academic conceptual term in the middle, or you can just skip to the end to my examples. And so if we're thinking about looking, listening, learning, locating oneself, broadly this self-reflective space, what can come out of this process of inquiry, of self-reflection for someone who is a restricted leaper is the sentiment that they are here, wherever here is, because they worked hard, and a lack of acknowledgement around other external factors, including people who might have supported their capacity to be there. The E, the engaging in discussions for a restricted leaper, might be someone who reaches out to, so in this case it could be a man who reaches out to a woman to sort of try to connect, and the following phrase is something that they say: it's sad that women are struggling to get here in this organization, in our organization, and making an assumption that because you're here with them that you've managed to sidestep these issues. So it's kind of like, okay, I know you meant to connect, but it feels a little bit off base, or it's that you didn't seem to understand that perhaps I have struggled too, just like other people. The A is asking probing questions. As opposed to asking sort of deep, thoughtful questions, it becomes really focused on asking marginalized professionals about what have they done, have they asked, have they leaned in, have they told their manager that they wanted to lead? So the onus of responsibility, there's an assumption, either implicit or explicit, that it is that the circumstances that the historically marginalized person is facing is based on their lack of effort, just as if they consider their own effort as predicting their own experiences. And the P, providing support for this person, might be something that also similarly suggests individualized efforts should be the catalyst for change. Wear pants if you want to be taken seriously. Learn to play golf. This is for you, Tina. straighten your hair if you want to be viewed as a professional, and put your head down and work harder. So I'm not suggesting that this is not allyship. I'm calling it a restricted leap behavior, a restricted form of allyship. It can be helpful. Some people might feel helped by this, but it is something that is much more restricted than others. And so what is the potential outcome of restricted leap behavior and with respect to the power dynamics? This reinforces the status quo. So responsive leap behavior, now we're moving toward the middle. With respect to responsive behavior, as we begin to walk through this paradigm here, we see a little bit more deeper exploration of the self, of one's experience. It's the acknowledgement that perhaps we've worked hard, but we've also had access to informal social networks that have provided me with resources and opportunity that others might not have. In engaging with someone who could benefit from allyship, saying that I can imagine that you feel personally affected by what's happening, given all that you've shared with me in the past. There's some sense of knowing, some sense of history potentially in this relationship that allows them to come at this engagement in this way. The questions that they ask are more grounded in feeling as if they want to know more about the negative experiences that have been had in their organization. The willingness to offer support, but only if the person wants that. And then with respect to providing support, it might look something more like, how can I introduce you to the opportunities and the resources that I've had access to? And so I suggest that this actually might destabilize the power imbalance, because by sharing resources, by sharing opportunities, we begin to challenge the notion that I can do it myself and I should do it myself. And then that would take us lastly to the final group, which I would suggest is the most progressive form of allyship, I think is the closest to Tina and Beth's shared sisterhood model here. And so as we think about this reflexivity, this self-reflection for people whose allyship actions fall into this group, this is being willing to admit that sometimes we've stood by and have not spoken up when we've observed other people in your vicinity engaging in practices that are not supportive of marginalized people's experiences. Communicating that you want to make sure that your experiences, perspectives, and ideas are amplified, not just yours as a potential ally. So now we're moving into more of this co-conspirator mindset. Asking questions that are about us working together collaboratively to change the biased cultural norms about, for example, professionalism in the workplace. And then if you are talking about allyship in a place where the other person you're working with, your co-conspirator, is not present, acknowledging them as a contributor to the ideas that you are sharing as to what needs to be done in the organization. So for example, saying to your senior colleagues, a group of our Black colleagues and I met, and we think it's time to rethink our recruitment and promotion practices. So the idea here is giving credit where credit is due. And so I suggest that this might change power structures because it subverts the status quo. All right, so quickly, the emotion that I use to explain how we have these different variations in restricted, responsive, and leap behavior is anxiety. And I recognize that there's not one form of anxiety, there are at least three. And the anxiety that we often talk about is actually the preventive kind, this self-focused, nearly paralytic, but not quite, inhibitory form of anxiety. And that's what I would suggest often leads people to engage in these more restricted forms of allyship. Now that is different from the other end, promotive anxiety, which is a much more, I would call it achiever's anxiety, future-oriented state of I am anxious that we will not be able to create a more equitable, inclusive organization and society if we don't get this right. And that's the anxiety that I feel. And the one in the middle is the one in the middle, the mix of the two. This is a paper where I suggest that, while I've been talking about top-down allyship initiatives as something that organizations create, the reality is that in many of our organizations today, nobody's telling anybody what to do, and so there's a lot of bumbling around as people try to figure out what does it mean to be an ally in this context. And so one of the contexts that I've studied where this happens is the US Army, where there isn't a lot of prescriptive around what people should do. And so I look at the experiences and the actions of male managers who are Black and white men, male senior officers. And so what I suggest in this paper is that as opposed to having a directive from the top in terms of what they should do, they tend to lean on the implicit norms and beliefs and ideals that are baked into the system as a way of determining what they should engage in. And so I talk about these as white hegemonic masculine ideals. I'm gonna place a bookmark here because Sanaz is gonna say a whole lot about that. It's like perfect, right? So Sanaz will say more about that. But this idea that these are the cultural ideals, the gendered and racialized cultural ideals that underlie the Army culture. And what happens for male managers is that they implicitly and unconsciously absorb these beliefs, and they begin to explain their career trajectories through this lens. And so for the group of allies who I call providers, they believe that they got there through meritocracy and colorblindness. Protectors believe they got there through conforming and outperforming, and promoters believe that they got there through networking and visibility. And if you just scroll all the way to the right, basically what I'm suggesting is the form of support that they then give to racial minority professionals reflects these internalized beliefs around what type of help you should need based on the type of help I think I got. At the end of the day, the punchline for the story, and I think what tends to trigger people about this paper, is I say, that's all great, but the reality is it has the unintended consequence of reifying the very system that necessitated allyship in the first place. The last thing I will say here before I end is that I come in and out of, should we organize and teach people how to do the things, or should we let them figure it out themselves? I have a paper that has 3 studies, and it's a quantitative paper where I was, like many of you, invited by a company to do race-focused diversity training in the months following George Floyd's murder. And so all of these other papers were floating around, and what I really wanted to understand was, what are the conditions under which I could help them to make this diversity training that they want me to do as effective as possible? It was mandated, it was all the things, it was managers, it felt like it could be potentially, very tense, and it was, but what we ended up finding out was the quality of the interactions that people had with their relational partners during the training really was the deciding factor as to whether or not they engaged in post-training allyship behavior. So this is to say that diversity training, educational experiences, obviously they're not the end-all be-all, but to the extent that we can create experiences where people begin to feel that I feel known and understood and validated for who I am, even if they're talking about my identity is really as a husband and a father and not a white person, we let that sit and we appreciate that as being someone's experience, particularly if we're sort of trying to think about how to get someone who sees themselves only through that lens to engage in allyship behavior after the training. So songs pop in my head a lot when I'm doing research, and as I was reflecting on this and love, I started thinking about this song. Because what always feels missing for me in my allyship research is the experience of people who were trying to support in this. And I certainly have other research that's focused on how we as people who are from historically marginalized groups process the world and try to accumulate support and resources for ourselves. And so for me, as I think about allyship, what also becomes important is to understand that for many of us who want an ally, it's about wanting you to show us that you love us in the way that we want to be loved. And that therein lies the opportunity and the challenge is how do we get there? So I don't have any answers for you, but thank you very much.